So now, and I have done my Git workflow, and what I'm going to do here, Control forward slash. Actually, in this case, Windows forward slash if you're on a Windows, but reach out if you want to know that keyboard shortcut or just search for it because it is a nice, handy thing to have. Okay, so now because I have all those, the output of limiting those three tables in my POA, POWA for attendance. Okay, so now here's what we're going to do, right? So now what we want to do is find, and actually I'm going to put this, find who wrote, okay? Who wrote, find who wrote the well, okay? So the well is a book, and we're going to find who wrote it. All right, so that's our challenge. Now, if you're somebody who's had some prior experience and wants to try this, you could totally do that, right? And if you're not, don't worry about it. We're going to do that. Again, we're doing a little bit of pre-learning here, okay? So what I would do first is just look at my data, right? So if I looked at my books, because I only printed out 10 of them, and yeah, I conveniently grabbed the title that was within the 10, but I could have went further in the list, right? I definitely could have done that, and I could have seen how many there were in, but I think you get the idea. So we want to know who wrote the whale, and here's the data that we have about that in the books table, right? So this second one, so this is the authors, these are the books, and these are the authored. Right, that combines these two tables, right? And again, I want to use the term join because it's a common thing we do, but we're going to learn joins after what you're about to learn, which is how to write first static and then dynamic queries. Okay. So let's start with the static ones, okay? So back in here, the first thing we're going to do is write a query just to find this whale title in the books, right? So I'm going to select. Now, I tend to, when I start things, do everything. Show me everything in books. And in this case, where now, I know I have an exact title. If I didn't have an exact title, I would use the like and then use the wildcards. But in this case, I happen to know, right, that my title, now if you don't remember that, you could look over here and go, oh yeah, that's the title, okay? Title equal, in this case, whale. Now, because I might misspell that, right? So now I can look at this. Now in this case, this is the example of me writing it here, but I'm going to go down and test it. Now the reason I kind of mentioned this before, but one of the things I recommend doing is kind of start doing it this way because it's going to lead us to something in the future that we're going to be doing. And again, I just think this is a better editor. And I'm actually almost curious how many of you are already doing it this way. It's a pretty natural progression. So I'd go to my SQLite 3. I'd do a shell.clear, right? I'd paste in that and I would see, okay, here we go, right? So here then is that specific record. So what I need to know here is actually the book ID. Okay, because if I go back and look, what I want to know in order to connect these two is I need the book ID here. Okay, so now what I want to do is because I have the book ID, boom, right? Now I can write another query to get the ID of the author. Okay, so let's now write that query. Okay, so how would I do that, right? I would do select. And again, we could limit the output, but for now, right? And I'm going to do now authored, right? Authored, where. Okay. Now here's where you have to start thinking about this, right? Because in this case, I'm actually looking at authored, right? So let's actually bring back the authored table, right? I have a book ID. I know what the book ID that I'm looking for is. It is book ID 2. So when I'm writing this query, I'd want to go book ID. Now, and you know, it's very specific. It's an underscore. And again, you're going to learn about this idea of keys, right? Where the book ID equal to a specific. Now, this is an integer number typically, and this came up last week. And by the way, if you want to know, this schema actually tells you the data types that are listed in here. So if we go look at authored, this is an integer for both book ID and author ID. Okay, so we wouldn't use quotes here. We would actually use the number. Okay, so now I'm like, okay, was this query right, and what does it show me? Cool. So now I have the entry. So now I'm writing, and Carter terms this one by one. I've always termed this static queries, okay, because we're going to write, in this case, we'll follow this up with a subquery, and you'll see that in a minute. But I call these static queries. But, and again, this is writing them for many-to-many relationships, and you'll see this as you move in to what Carter's going to show you. So we're almost there now, okay? So now we've queried the books, we've found well tell. What got returned back to us was a 2. We then hard-coded that 2 in our next query to find, right, the entry in the authored table that gives us the author ID, because that's what we need to know to answer the question of who wrote. Find who wrote the well. Okay, so now we'd write our next one, right? So select star from, in this case, authors. I believe that's right. If I'm not sure, I could come over here and go, yeah, authors, right? And that, again, kind of gives you a little hint, right? It wouldn't be author, it'd be authors, right? And this would be where. Now, where would be, we were going to look for what? And in this case, you might think author ID. Because we're looking in authors, if we go over here and look at this, we have an ID. And the foreign key here references that author ID. So where we have author ID in this table, that's the authored, it actually is a foreign key that matches up with what is the ID in the authors table. And this is part of what you learned this week. This is how we write queries across tables, okay? So in this case, right, we would say ID, and we have now a number, which is 13. Okay, so now let's see how that goes. Copy that, right? Cool, so we can now answer the question, who wrote well? Okay, and that's awesome. So these are, again, Carter's going to call them one by one. I call them static, but it's writing one by one queries, static queries. For, in this case, we had to have 3 different queries to answer this question because of the way these relationships between authors and books is set up by a one-to-one. And we needed this intermediate authored. They've put wrote here just so you can, like, talk about what their relationships are. Okay, so that's great. So now we have that piece, right? So what we're going to do is, I'm trying to see if I've walked through everything I want you to know now, because now, right, and I will have you'll see me do this as we approach more and more content. I'll say first write, and I'm going to term them static queries because I like that term, but you could also call them one by one. But the next thing we're going to do is actually convert this into what you're going to learn this week, which is a subquery. But let's stop for this one. The commit message for this one will be, surprise, surprise, video 2.